Je sais pas si on
Hello, everybody. Right now, see that in French we have about 15 participants. Well, we'll be getting started. It's, time has started, so I just wanted to let everyone know that I'll be speaking in English, just so things can be a little bit easier for those of you who would like to participate in the conference. Obviously, Janice Fine is with us. We'll be speaking in English. Since I'm speaking with her, I'll be speaking in English as well. So for those of you who would like to listen in English, you can go to the English channel. And for those who want to listen in French, you'll be able to listen in French as well.
First of all, I would like to thank Melanie, Claude, and all the staff at the CRISES and Engagent for assisting the preparation of the symposium. It's a great challenge to organize this kind of event online. It's not easy for anybody, so hopefully everybody gets a good experience from it. This morning we have Janice Fine, Professor Fine from Rutgers University that will do her talk on resisting the future of work, constructing a future for workers. Mrs. Fine is the key co-founder and director of research and strategy at the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at the Rutgers University, like I said. She holds a PhD in political science from the MIT, and she teaches at the Labor Studies and Employment Relation at she teaches Labor Studies and Employment Relation at the School of Management and Labor Relation at the Rutgers University. Mrs. Fine, as you probably know, works on the collective organization of low-wage workers in the U.S. She is, I would say, a thinker of new and innovative strategies from our collective organizations, new union practices. She studies in, I would say, an historical perspective the labor struggle in the U.S., and she is the author of Workers' Centers, Organizing Communities at the Edge of the Dream, that was published in 2006. And before becoming a professor at the Rutgers University, Mrs. Fine was working for 20 years as a community organizer in the U.S. So that's it. So before we start, first of all, that will be in webinar mode. So that means that if you want to ask a question, you put it in the sidebar on your website. And then when we're going to go through the question period, I'll be able to address the question to Janice for you. We have 1 hour. And this conference will be record. And you will be able to assist and watch it until the 30th of April. Before I go through, maybe because most of you probably have already watched the conference of Professor Fine, which is on the website. I'll go through the conference. I'll maybe present the headlines of the conference, but do some contextualization also, and I'll try to do some links with the situation here in Quebec and Canada. But before I do this, maybe Janice, you want to have introductory word with the participants. So would you just add the first comments, and then I'll go with this.
No, Yanick, it's fine for you to go ahead. I'll just say what a pleasure it is. I wish I could see all you, all of the participants. It's sort of such a strange thing not to see anyone. But I'm happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of weird to be just alone in our office and screen. We get this when we teach, so hopefully, but people are there. So what I would like to say about the conference, Janice had was very nice to provide us. I like the title. Maybe it could look a bit superficial, but you somehow reverse the question. Now we're speaking always about the future of work. Now let's think about the workers and what are the options regarding constructing constructing a future of the workers. So you can somehow reverse the thematic that we always discuss in a way that I really like. Here at CRISES, the CRISES is a center on social innovation. And when we speak about social innovation, we tend to always look at progressive innovation, things that we like. But also what I think it's very interesting in your presentation is that you also insist that there are some innovation, social, I would say, socio-economic innovation, that are destructive and that are enhancing or enabling and asking for new response from the working community. And this is, I think, interesting it's important to reverse the question, to also stress out that innovation can go both ways. And that's it. So in your presentation, you speak about the structural power of workers, the associational powers of the workers, and the institutional power. Mm-hmm. But regarding the first thematic, regarding the change in work, I think you stress out a lot of elements that I would say even the general public is somehow seeing more closely, especially with COVID. All the question of subcontracting, the emergence of gig jobs, the gig economy, the new ways, also the new surveillance techniques, the new monitoring techniques, the intensification of work that goes with the app, but not only the app, with the, I would say, digital empowering of the surveillance apparatus or the algorithm. One of my students, Rabbi Jamil, I will mention him, is speaking about the algopticon, like the app panopticon. And you stress out that one of the important, what we have to, when we want to see what's at the core of this, it's the centralization of power at the same time as we assist to the decentralization of the production. And also the new feature of this is also I would say the informatization or the automatization of hiring procedures. So you can start to work for a business without even seeing anybody. You're chosen by an algorithm, you work, and you're also fired by an algorithm if you don't have managed to. So, we're there. And this technological innovation is somehow, and it's always used as a camouflage for the degradation of the labor relations. And I think you stress this, and I would like maybe to add also that it's also the reason why even when venture capitalists that invest in Uber, that invest in those new technologies, they're not interested in workers. They're not interested in human. So to give this human-less face of a business, it's also good to attract money for your business from the capitalist perspective, of course. So this I would say, this going around the human face or the businesses and the new is a structuring feature of the capitalists of the 21st century. Regarding, I will just say a few words more regarding the three features. You said that you talk about structural power, sociational power, and institutional power. Regarding the structural change, you say structural power comes with, like, when it's low, when there's low unemployment, when the businesses have difficulty to access to qualified workers. Usually it's good for the workers. They could negotiate a bit more their salary, especially if what they're doing is strategically placed in the, I would say, chain of production. But this, you say that in the US, this is going down. There's not a lot of power, structural power. I will add that in Quebec, maybe it's a bit different because since a few years, they're talking a lot about a labor shortage, and usually this should push the minimum wage a bit further. But as I will address in the question, I think the state is powerful influence on this. So when structural power go in the way of the workers, I think the 21st neoliberal state is a major is acting in a way to reduce this power structure. And so, as you say, the power structure is going down. So, what is there? There's a social, like collective organization power, and I think most of your article or your paper, your conference was about this. It's somehow optimistic, even though the union rate is going down. There is a lot of new fights that are hopefully going good, but if you want to keep it on the optimist side, there's the fight for 15, there's the increase of minimum wage, there is access to sick days in some jurisdiction in the US. We have this morning, we somehow know that Amazon Bessemer Union Drive is not maybe going as good as it was supposed to, but just the fact that the major company like Amazon is getting targeted and somehow very stressed about getting unionized is, I would say, in the US context, a major win. You also show some optimism regarding the Biden presidency. Maybe not that much, but somehow still there is some optimism to go on this side. And also optimism that steers from the, I would say, new counter-technological movement coming from the workers themselves or from the union. You didn't speak directly about platform corporatism, but I think it would go in what you're trying to say. You speak about digital resistance, using WhatsApp, using the Facebook page, organizing through other means, I would say. This is another very interesting part of the conference that I really liked. And also the institutional power, like the challenges that is maybe a bit more, I would say, juridicized, the legal challenges, the re-regulations, the fights for AB5 in California, for example. I mean, the fight against the retractation of AB5, some important wins, for example, Uber workers being labeled not as independent contractors in UK. So you're speaking about this, and you also argue that associational power has to be in line with institutional power, and both of them are, I would say, feeding each other. So this is what I got from your conference. I think that's sort of the major elements you wanted to address us. Over there, I would say that more broadly, what you're doing is a portrait of the state-of-the-art, actual portrait of the alt labor movement in the US. And I think it's, but of course, your conference is contextualized in the US situation. I've done some research in Argentina recently. In India, we know a bit of the situation here in Canada. Obviously, the challenges are contextualized, are different from one place to another. But the precarization of work, the challenge to unions, the collective organization are somehow, I would say, more or less the same everywhere, even though I would say the material basis is not always the same. Obviously, workers in India are in a very worse situation, but the challenges in rethinking the future of the workers, to take the word that you are using, are somehow similar everywhere. And I think this could be a base for the conversation we're going to have today. So that's what I got from your conference. It's your conference, so I don't want to speak too long. But maybe you would like, Janice, to add a bit other things about this for you, things that I didn't maybe mention, but for you are very important. So I'll give you handle you the microphone.
Okay.
And then we can go to the questions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you've done an excellent job of summarizing my my contribution. I'll just say a couple of things just to underline. Fundamentally, I believe that structural power is essential, right? Like, that we have to get to the point where workers are able to strike again and withhold their labor. So it's not that I think that structural power is irrelevant. I think structural power is essential. That said, given what's happened to the labor movement, as you say, not just in the United States, not just in Canada, but worldwide, what I was trying to do is make a distinction between structural power, the real power of labor, the fundamental power of labor, our ability to withhold our centrality in a labor supply chain, et cetera, that makes it possible, that is the most powerful thing that we can do. I was trying to argue that in the absence of that, that there's still associational power, and that associational power is enabling particularly low-wage workers in the U.S. to fight well above their weight class, because they're bringing their own strategic capacity. They are organizing workers who haven't been traditionally part of the labor movement, and they're really creative. And so, and that they're winning through associational power and institutional power, that which they right now have not been able to achieve through structural power. So I don't want it to sound Pollyanna-ish, right? This is a less good option than if we had the kind of structural power that I think we'd all like to see. And it's not completely true, right? In the public sector, particularly teachers have used their structural power in some really, they have been able to intervene directly and have been able to compel concessions because of their place in the economy. Not so much healthcare workers, though. And anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing I was trying to argue was that it's this kind of determinist attitude that, at least in the US, the kind of intellectual and kind of journalistic account of the future of workers, it's like there's nothing we can do about it. We have no ability to govern the market. It's like a meteor crashing down on us, and all we can do is cover our heads and run. And that, I was, I'm trying to argue that that this is incredibly destructive, and that workers have faced these challenges before. There's this way that technology now gets portrayed as though we've never been through these major ruptures in the past, and we have. Okay, and then the other thing is that worker organizations are taking advantage of the affordances of social media, of digital tools, right? That they're not saying, oh, it's only face-to-face organizing or nothing. They're not rejecting, all the affordances of digital to do organizing. And so the other sort of front that they've opened is through the online organizing that they're doing. And so I wanted to point out, right, the ways in which organizations are not rejecting technology. They're actually trying to use technology to organize, and that's a pretty interesting. That it's a pretty interesting moment, I think, in that regard, right? Because there are these opportunities that tech provides that I tried to discuss in the paper that I think are really interesting, and more of them are emerging every day, right? People trying to figure out how to use the algorithms, how to collectively, kind of stick a, to stop the machine, in one way or another. But anyway, I think you captured it, and I know you have questions that I thought were terrific. So, I'm fine with going to your questions. Okay. And I'd like to talk about Amazon, because I think it's very likely that I think that they're going to lose, and probably people would like to talk a little bit about why.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go maybe in the order that but we'll go with the discussion how it goes. But I would like to bounce back maybe on the first thing that you say, like this somehow big blind spot where we say that we're not able to. I don't listen. Wait a second. I think I lost you. Is it possible?
No, I'm here.
Okay. It's just I think that it's delay. One of the blind spots that you addressed, that like we're stuck in I would say a mode of thinking that says we cannot do anything about the market. The market is there; it cannot be controlled. And I think as COVID has shown, I don't know, from the Canadian perspective at least, the state was everywhere. When there was a disruption, like the protection PPAs were not coming. There were not sufficient masks. I'm talking about the beginning. People needed money because they lost their jobs, and then it was super normal that the state will be there. The state will order. Our prime minister was speaking almost as if he was directly himself buying some PPIs in the street. I don't know, but what I mean is this is a metaphor. But what I mean is that the state was everywhere. When things are not going fine, who's going to save capitalism? Who's going to save us? It's the state. So obviously the state has a major role to play, and for me it's important to mention it. But then, what role is it playing? Somehow. It would be dishonest to say that in Canada the state did it did provide some benefits to workers. We did not have to wait for 1 year to get $1,400 checks. There was a employment insurance schemes that were set up quite rapidly with some. It was not perfect, but it was done rapidly. But for me, and to go back to the structural power and the eroding of structural power that we see in the 21st century capitalism, I think we really have to address the question of the state and what is it doing. And I'm going to read you directly the question that I mentioned to you. So, Professor Fine, in your paper that I greatly appreciated, and as I hope my little presentation shows, you're insisting convincingly on the role of the innovatively destructive employment practices put in place by the Amazon of this world in arming the structural power of the workers in the 21st century. As I have mentioned earlier in Quebec, and especially during the COVID pandemic, we have seen the state acting almost like a temp agency somehow, trying to provide low-wage workers in industry that were having difficulty finding workers. Because just a parenthesis, one of the first things that happened at the beginning of the pandemic was guest work program was stopped. The borders were closed. People were not able to come. Then we rapidly realized that we cannot eat if they're not working. So they had to come. But in the meantime, there was a labor shortage in the agricultural sector, and the government says, well, we're gonna have to find locals to do it. And we're going to pay them an extra $100 per week. They by doing this, they recognize that the pay is too low. They recognize that it's exploitation of foreign workers in a new neo-colonialist schemes, I would say. But they've done it in agriculture. They've done it in health sector. And then more broadly for all essential workers, I would say, by giving a supplemental wage. So I'm not against that. But somehow when we do that, it will be the same for the food stamps in the US. We are somehow subsidizing employers that are paying below the wage. Mm-hmm. So from the standpoint of an American researcher, I guess this can somehow be seen as another example of the better security net in Canada. But the question I want to ask you is this. What would you have to say about the role of the neoliberal state actively producing, subsidizing low-wage labor markets? for business and needs of workers, either through guest work program, as I said, food stamp, or other wage supplement measure, while keeping, for me, the last part of the question is important, while keeping the minimum wage below the bare minimum. So I would like
to. Yeah, Yanick, I think it's a good question. And what I thought about when you posed the question was, similar in the U.S., there was a debate here about providing full payroll replacement, but only to businesses that agreed to no layoffs. Mm-hmm. And it went nowhere, right? The federal government didn't agree to it. But we also didn't have the labor shortages for low-wage workers that you did. So the thing is, in the service sector, the low-wage workforce here, they were unable to choose not to work during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So when they stopped receiving the hazard pay subsidy from their employers, they did not have, or at least they did not feel that they had the structural power to insist upon it through striking. So instead, they have been fighting for it through institutional means. So I agree that the neoliberal state subsidizes a low-wage labor force at the federal level, both for the U.S. workforce and for guest workers at the federal level. My argument was about the state and local level, where there are enough progressive legislators to pass much more progressive policy, despite a discourse that it's interesting, right? I just wrote a paper for the Economic Policy Institute looking at the discourse at the local level. So as these policies are passing, still all the first thing out of the mouths of the legislators is, the most important thing, though, is that we not hurt business. And then they go ahead and they pass these pretty progressive kind of visionary ideas at the local level. So they have been willing to engage in much more visionary policymaking with much stronger enforcement. So that's really what I would say, right, is that it's federalism here, right? It's the ways that, particularly at the local city level and in some states, there's been a really different discourse and a really different policy climate that's resulted in much more sweeping policy change than at the federal level.
Yeah, I think this is a very important thing that we have to address the local powers, the federal powers. It's the same somehow in Quebec and Canada. We have seen, I would say, a much stronger response from the federal level than the local authorities. Regarding the fight that were done, I think there's also, it was interesting to see, and for me, it was a challenge to see that, yes, a lot of workers did have some COVID bonuses, but it was always labeled as temporary.
Yeah.
And at least in Quebec, as soon as we reach June, July 2020, all this was done. The COVID was finished. For me, that's why for me it's important to see this in relation to the temp agency role of the state, because once the labor is there, we don't need to pay them anymore. So by that time, the labor shortages was somehow...
Oh, yeah, I know. But what's been interesting, right, is that at the local level, the hazard pay was restored.
Okay.
In Seattle and in other cities like New York, right? Mm-hmm. So and it's required, right? So they're now requiring hazard pay in different sectors of the economy at the local level, and that's pretty interesting. But yeah, no, I completely get what you're saying, and I think it's a terrible frustration.
Yeah. I have other questions, but I want to also to give places to people that are listening to us. So I have here a question coming from Paul-André. Paul-André Lapointe is a professor at the University of Chicoutimi, and he is maybe he would like to listen to you a bit more about the worker centers. You work a lot about around the worker centers. Worker centers were I would say at the first, there was at the upfront of a lot of movements that are happening recently in the U.S. and he wants to know, it's his question, for you, are the worker centers the future of workers, like of organizing somehow? And maybe he would like to have you speak about like what is your stand on formal unionism versus worker centers?
Yeah, I guess, Albert Hirschman once said he was interested in all the animals in the zoo, A to Z. I would say that's the same with me. I'm not, I think, I have been really inspired by the work that the worker centers and sort of the broader alt labor movement have been doing in the last, 30 years. And frankly, I think during the pandemic, some of the most innovative, interesting organizing actually has come out of alt labor. And so, that's worker centers and United for Respect, which is a national organization that started with the Walmart workers, but has expanded to all retail workers, and they organized the Toys R Us workers, and they're organizing the Dollar General workers, and they're in general kind of creating a retail workers organization. And then there's, we have a whole coalition of groups that are working on Amazon. So there's the local geographically based worker centers, and then there's like these broader worker associations that I get into in the paper a bit. And I think that a lot of the sort of dynamism, sort of where the ideas are coming from in some ways, have been out of alt labor, as well as, some of the unions like the Service Employees International Union, which, completely supported, undergirded, financed, and provided organizing support to the Fight for 15 movement. And more recently, the hotel workers, again, right. So SEIU is a formal union. Likewise, the hotel workers who ended up with, over 90% of their members laid off because of the pandemic have been, engaging in, it was like they turned into this grassroots army that they, thousands and thousands of their members got involved in the election, made a huge difference in Pennsylvania, and Georgia and some of the swing states, and also fought for the right to be reinstated, and have passed at the local level laws that say that, when these companies reopen, they have to give right of first refusal to these workers. So I think that, anyway, so with that being said, I'll just say that in terms of the worker centers, I think that they have been at the forefront in many of these campaigns, whether it was the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights work that's happened over the last few years, whether it's been the fight over Amazon, where, I tried to address in my paper that it's been some worker centers. There was a worker center of Somalian immigrants, of East African immigrants in Minnesota that won the first concessions from Amazon in the country around Ramadan, and having prayer space, and also around the rate of production. That was in in the warehouses with over 1,000 East African workers who took action and went on a short strike and demanded some. And then another worker center in New York, Make the Road New York, was part of a coalition of low-wage organizations, community organizing groups that together stopped Amazon in its tracks. It had chosen Queens, New York, Long Island City as HQ2, right? As the, they did this beauty contest to see who would throw the most subsidies out, to capture the second Amazon headquarters after Seattle. New York won. And then the organizing was so intense, and the organizing was demanding that there be a non-interference agreement on the part of Amazon, so that workers really had a meaningful right to organize, and that Amazon would stop complying with ICE, stop assisting ICE in facial recognition software and other things. They not only created us, they campaigned for this. And because they had also started to do electoral politics, some of these worker centers, the larger ones, have really developed their electoral capabilities and developed deep relationships with some progressive elected officials. They had a number of elected officials that came out and said, yeah, we agree. Amazon shouldn't come here unless they agree to these things. And as a consequence, Jeff Bezos picked up his marbles and went home. He said, all right, we're not coming to New York. And, some people were pretty angry about that. and saw it as a defeat. But the organizations claimed it as a victory. They said, yeah, we're not just going to accept Amazon on any terms. We're going to insist that, it's not their way or the highway. We're going to, and so I could go on and on. I mean, around the pandemic, worker centers across the country have been at the forefront of demanding PPE, demanding that their governors take action, winning concessions, winning protections. In Los Angeles, there's been a fight, a successful fight to have worker centers formally brought in to provide training to their workforces to be subsidized financially, and then to be able to go into workplaces to educate workers about their rights and to intervene around problems with health and safety. So, and there's a coalition, a national coalition that's been created by Jobs with Justice and a number of the worker centers around the country called Always Essential. And what they're trying to do is lift up the idea that this essential workers framework doesn't just apply during the pandemic. It ought to apply in general. And they've been organizing around, trying to really establish that frame of always essential and fight for the rights of these workforces, both in terms of health and safety and also raising the wages, raising benefit levels, et cetera.
Okay. Thank you, Janice. And I think, as you know a lot more than me, those framing, yes, we're somehow stuck in the pandemic, and we see that. But this is a long-standing reframing from the union. We can go back to the Justice for Janitor campaign in the 90s, and this is something that needs time. Also, we're always very we want result right now. We see that it was a loss maybe at Amazon now, but if we want to stay optimist, we have to see that those struggles are inscribing themselves in history, and things are moving with time. Because you speak about worker centers, I would like to maybe take 1 minute here to mention here in Quebec, we have the CTI, the IWC, Centre des Travailleurs Immigrants, that have been, I would say, that have done a marvelous jobs during this pandemic. We have this chain that is called Dolorama here in Montreal, and they were able, it's never perfect, but they were able to increase the wages of the workers, somehow give them a bit more protection during the pandemic, and those worker centers, as you mentioned, are special. For me, are very important in the at least to bring the unions to move towards more progressive strategic organizing.
Right. Yeah.
One thing that you mentioned here for me it's interesting, and that is for me different in Canada, is those ties between the worker centers and the labor movement and the politics. We used to say it was the reverse, but I think in recent years there is somehow the connection from the political system and the union activities. All this organizing for the Democrats, maybe I guess the Trump situation was something also special that instils some new practices because Trump. I won't say more. But that's certainly a challenge that we have here in Canada, building some proximity between the politics and real proximity, but effective proximity, because sometimes too much proximity with the political power have not always been good for union movement in Canada. So I think it's an interesting question. To build on those questions, I have a question from Thomas Colomba and one from Martine Damour. I will ask them together because I think they are somehow linked. We speak about the workers. You spoke about the worker centers as new ways of organizing. Thomas is asking the question about labor councils. Like sometimes it's I'm open. I hope I'm okay with you. I'm saying the question the way you want, Thomas. But for example, in Toronto, there is a labor council around the city. It's not so much effective, I think, in Montreal. But what would be the role of those labor councils? That's one thing. And maybe more broadly, as Martine Damour is asking, and I'm going to read you your question, She says, Professor Fine, thank you for your conference. It's very interesting. I would like to know, what do you think about the proposition of the document produced by the Harvard Law School after a 2-year consultation? She speaks about the clean slate for worker power, building a just economy and democracy, about the ways to ensure workers' representation, negotiation, beyond the current site-based organization. I ask those questions together because I think they are somehow linked, and it's also linked with the worker center question. Is like this Wagner Act model of on-site organizing in the 21st century capitalism is, we see it as its limits, and we have to find other ways. So we spoke about the worker center. What about the labor council? And what about other options? That would be the question, if I'm right, that I'm transferring.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that in general, I love your question about the central labor councils, because, in the US, central labor councils, I think, have also been inside the labor movement. They've been the place at the city level or the county level where both where solidarity has been built between unions, which is so important, I think, because here in the US, I don't know if you guys are experiencing this as much, but in the US, unfortunately, I think in the last several years, there has been more division between public and private sector workers. They've really been set against each other, where there's been kind of this bitterness about the generous pensions of public sector unions versus, and private sector workers, particularly in construction, feeling like that's coming out of their, infrastructure funds that could be available for infrastructure and things like that. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible problem. Central labor councils are really important for sort of creating and preserving solidarity between public and private sector unions and with the community. So central labor councils in the US, I think, have been, not all of them, right? Some of them are sleepy and, and poorly, not really dynamic. But there are many central labor councils that are really important centers of activity, and central labor councils where worker centers have actually been given formal seats at the table, right? Have actually been formally recognized and affiliated to the Central Labor Council. So I'd like to see more of that, but that's happened, and I don't know exactly what the number is now, but it's probably 25 or 30 Central Labor Councils have worker centers. And one Central Labor Council in Boston, the woman who is now the, incredible leader of the Central Labor Council came out of an alt labor group. Mm-hmm. And her predecessor, Marty Walsh, became the mayor of Boston and is now our U.S. Secretary of Labor. So that would have been unheard of, unheard of. So there has been this kind of, the pretty major opening inside the labor movement. Okay, so that's one. Now, your second question about the Clean Slate Project, I think it's great. I was involved in the early days, but I think it's fantastic. I think if people haven't read the full proposal, it's really worth it. And what I really like about it is that it sort of has a range from what every worker and every workplace ought to have, right? From works councils and health and safety committees, the right to organize, all the way to sectoral bargaining. And so it's very visionary. It's super interesting. It draws on, sectoral structures from around the world, and it draws on the Ghent system. And there's just a lot of interesting pieces. So yeah, I think it's great. Also, the PRO Act, which is the labor law reform that was just passed in our Congress and is now, what's being debated, whether there'll be enough votes to pass it in the Senate, which will only happen if we can get rid of the filibuster and be able to do a simple majority. But the PRO Act is the law that is also a very sweeping proposal that would deal with all of the major problems. I mean, all of the major problems in our current National Labor Relations Act and, kind of what's weakened it over the years. So the PRO Act goes right at subcontracting, independent contracting, secondary boycott, the problem of not getting to a first contract even after workers win, unions win their elections. I'm spacing out on what some of the other, but it's very good, and it's exciting that it's gotten as far as it has, and that kind of thing. So I think the clean slate stuff is great, and I think the looking at sectoral bargaining is great. I think the problem is that wishing doesn't make it so, right? Like that there's a way that sectoral bargaining would be great, but I remember years ago, I went to South Africa, and after the fall of the apartheid regime, when the ANC took power, there was this like amazing corporatist system that was put in place. Like it was beautiful. It was everything, all the bells and whistles of, sectoral bargaining and, what we would want in terms of corporatism. And you know what? It was like a museum piece. They never used it. So, I think it's good for us to have this vision. And I think that it's really, really useful to think about at the state and local level. And I think that, sectoral bargaining, there just needs to be this recognition that there's a limit to what you can do if unions don't have workplace power. They don't have, structural power.
It's very interesting what you mentioned about this museumization of the sectoral negotiation, because in Quebec, if I'm not wrong, we are the only jurisdiction that we have it. We have this law in Quebec. It's possible to do it. We have it in the construction sector, for example, but more and more it's becoming a museum. Over the last years, the last 20, 25 years now, those sectoral negotiations are less and less and less and less. But it's there. It's in the book. It's the instrument that we can use. But obviously, governments are not going this way. It's interesting that you speak about the PRO Act. I'm tempted to ask you, is it going to go through? But it will. We'll just move on. It will just bring us to a speculation, I guess. We have here in Quebec, Loi 59, so project of Law 59 about the health and safety standards that is going right now, and what we see in this changing of law, it's really a reduction. So it's not innovative, it's not progressive. We see the lowering of the health and safety features of the law. So it's somehow encouraging. It's somehow nice to see that at least in the US there are some legislative legislative bills that are maybe going to change things a little bit. I would like to, because I have a few questions here. A lot of them are about transnational labor politics, I would say. I had a question about this, and there are two others. So I'll read first a question by Amélie Nguyen, which is that wants to ask you, in your views, what are the best tools and strategies to confront the power imbalance faced by workers worldwide working in global supply chain? In the context of the absences of juridical mechanism of sanction at the international and often national level, and I would say WTO, etc., which does not link labor commercial negotiation to labor negotiation. There was also a question from Thomas regarding the international. Do you believe, he wants to ask you, do you believe the ILO and transnational strategies more broadly have a significant impact in those discussions? It's somehow maybe a related question to the one that Amélie Nguyen is asking you. And I'm going to add the one that I prepare on this, and it's maybe a bit more simple, not as thoughtful as the two that I just read to you. But My question was that we've seen in Europe, for example, because you speak about a lot about the gig workers, the Uber, the deliveristas in New York. We've seen in Europe, for example, with the Deliveroo case, that there are possibilities for international solidarities in this global chain of labor, 21st century gig economy, if I'm going to make it short. So it's possible, but my question is, and I'm going to go back to the labor history of the union movement in the state. I will not go back to, but we know that in history, the labor movement in the US was somehow a channel of the power of the US over its border, to make it, to see it as an euphemism. This alt labor movement you're speaking about, are they ready for international solidarity with precarized, marginalized, and colonized workers around the world? It's a big question, but I would like you to address you. Is it something that is spoken about?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll just start by saying that, so in some ways, worker centers are kind of internationalist from the get-go, right? Because a lot of the people who established them are migrant workers who came from somewhere else and who came from countries, right? You know, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, the founders, you know, emerged from the Salvadoran, liberation struggle, right? Very much, right? A consequence of U.S. foreign policy, right? The Salvadoran War, right? El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam, we used to say, right? So, so the worker centers all over the country, right? There's people who came out of the Salvadoran experience. There's people who came out of the Filipino democracy movement, and who really have in there, and people who came out of, who know very well the Brazilian workers movement, everywhere, right? The Korean democracy movement, right? The worker centers are alive with connections that are sort of, embedded in their DNA, right? So, so I feel like they've been deeply engaged with their home countries and their regions, and people have major movement experience, and many of the worker centers have been involved in global solidarity work and global campaigns on a common corporate target. So I think that answer is, to me, it's pretty clear. And I have to say that while it's true that the AFL-CIO has this terrible history with having played a role in, in particular, the Central American wars, at the same time, the Solidarity Center, which is, was sort of reinvented when the Social Democrats were kind of displaced at the AFL-CIO and replaced with progressives who had a progressive view of foreign policy. The Solidarity Center has played a great role, right? A really progressive role since 1995 in terms of supporting organizing and supporting alt labor around the world, and supporting worker centers and supporting progressive forces and unions around the world. It, we'll never be able to erase the history, but it's really important to recognize that the history has been, that the history has been recognized, and that the labor movement has gone in a different direction. The WRC and the Global Labor Justice, these are organizations, Jobs with Justice, others that are doing all kinds of interesting work. At our center, the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, we've long had a partnership with IFWIA, and we are actually working to create a global labor leadership, particularly focused on women, labor leadership school, to kind of create an opportunity for women in low-wage industries, in low-wage sectors, and in the traditional labor movement to learn and create community together. So that's a new project that we've been involved with. I guess what I would say is, I think some of the GUFs, the Global Labor Union Federations, particularly UNI, are doing some really fabulous work. None of it is decisive yet. I wish I could say otherwise, right? I feel like it's really important just to remain hopeful. But it doesn't mean that I don't see that, that this enormous asymmetry of power means that, we are, we're not winning. I would never say otherwise. I think that what's been really critical, though, is that the organizations that are doing the best are the ones that are not necessarily the biggest. They're the ones that are thinking differently about strategy and looking for the opportunities for intervention and making those interventions where they can. And in terms of the question about the ILO, some of the most exciting organizing that went on was around the campaign for the Domestic Worker Convention 189. And that was actually led by the domestic worker movement around the world, and the National Domestic Workers Alliance in the US played a really important role in kind of bringing those organizations together. So, I'm always amazed at how important the ILO is to so many countries and how beside the point it is in the US and how frustrating that is. But I think that people have used the ILO to great effect.
So thank you again. It could almost be a concluding line. I have negotiated a few 5 or 6 minutes more with the organizers while you were speaking, and I would like to because there are other questions here in the feed. Maybe 2 things to conclude, and and maybe if you want to choose which one, or you speak at length about one or the other, or you do what you want. You're the boss. But there's 2 things. First question is quite simple. It goes back to the technology challenge that you address. It's very simple. You're mentioning in your speak, in your paper and your conference about using WhatsApp, using Facebook pages. Rabbi Jamil, and I had a similar question, is asking, should we rely on this major capitalist organization to organize, or should the union movement build their own technological tools to fight and to organize? That's one question. And the other question for me is more about the larger public opinion and the challenge. I don't know. I think I wrote it, but it was not. I'm not completely satisfied the way I wrote the question to you. But for me, the question was around this thing that happened in California. Of course, like Uber put 200 millions on the table to publicize their falsehoods, to make it, to say it simple. So there is this money thing, but we go beyond this. How can the union fights pass the democratic test? That's how I would label it. Like, we had a fight, they won, there was something good, and then the population, which are a lot of them are users of Uber. They don't want Uber to be. They want Uber to be cheap, to remain cheap. They want to use cheap labor somehow, and they vote against. They vote for the retractation of the. So my question is broader than this, but how can we make sure that the interests of the consumers are the same interests as the one of the workers, and in order to have the citizens that are voting, people that are voting are citizens. It's not consumers, it's not workers or citizens. How can we make sure that citizens address this conflicting challenge, which is coming from the fact that they are workers, but they are also consumers? And sometimes those 2 roles that we have in the are conflicting.
I hear you.
I hope you get the essential.
I totally understand. I mean, let me just say, actually, in the AB5 fight, the message that Uber was, Uber spent millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? Over $200 million, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, et cetera, to roll back AB5 for drivers. But their message was not so much about consumers. It was saying that drivers were going to lose their flexibility and that drivers were against it, right? So it's even more insidious than that, right? And so I'll just say, first of all, that I feel like, it's why the labor movement in the U.S. has been for public financing of elections and for major campaign finance reform for years, right? Because democracy, we can't separate the right of workers to organize and the right, for us to have, real free and fair elections. And, it's like so much of it was misinformation. But when you have $200 million, just like with captive audience speeches that Amazon just did day in and day out in Bessemer, Alabama, right? Like, when you've got that kind of, when those kinds of things are legal, it's very difficult to resist. Your broader question, though, about consumer versus producer, I think is at the heart of a lot of what we have to figure out. And it's been a problem, in our movements forever, right? Like, there have been debates going back, to the 1800s with major labor leaders I know of in the U.S. anyway, and in 1900s as well, where you had some where the focus on linking producer and consumer, right? Getting consumers to think like producers and producers to, getting consumers to really understand what their stake was in these fights. I grew up with the ILGWU, with the ladies garment workers, and we would sing the song, always look for the union label. And, there were things like that. But generally speaking, we have not done, a good job at this. I actually think there's hopeful signs, the fact that like in the food chain, there's more focus on, you can't just talk about slow food or organic food and not talk about worker rights. Right, a linkage in the garment supply chain, like more of a focus on, where did your clothes come from and what does this mean in restaurant? So restaurant work, agricultural work. I feel like we are seeing more of a kind of, and I think in part the climate catastrophe is making people in general pay more attention to, to resources. So, could this be like a moment when the consumer producer dichotomy starts to kind of, braid back together? I think it's a huge and important and central question. So anyway, that's what I would say. Now around the tech, so the tech, what I would say is, while I was writing this paper for you guys, I was thinking about one of my most important sheroes in my life is Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde's famous quote is, among many, was, you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I'm all in favor of platform cooperatism. I'm all in favor of in my view, Amazon and Facebook ought to be public utilities, right? That's what they are. Whether labor does their own or whether, I actually think that some of these things should become, public utilities. But I actually think it doesn't really matter what I think. Workers are using these tools, right? Like, migrant workers are using WhatsApp, right? That's what they're using. They're, people are meeting in Facebook groups. So whether or not we think that they should use an alternative, it's like they're using what they're using. And what I think is important is that we meet them where they are, and that we take advantage of those spaces to organize.
Perfect. So thank you, Janice, Professor Fine. I hope, for me, I had a very nice conversation. Interesting for me. I hope it was the same for you.
That was great. Yeah.
And I hope it was the same for people online. Those are the challenge of of the webinar format where we don't see the face of the people.
I know. Yeah.
We know they're there, but we don't see how they react. But I hope, and I'm almost sure that everybody really enjoyed the discussion we had. So I want to thank you again. It was a lot of work. You provide us with the video, with the conference. I will tell the people that maybe some of the people here did not have the time to watch the conference. So I would really insist in saying to them that it's worth doing it. So take the time to go and watch Professor Fine conference. I think it's very insightful. And thank you again, Janice. And hopefully we met a few years ago at the GIREPS colloque in Montreal. Hopefully we can see you in person shortly. Yeah. I see you're in good health. And I'm very happy about this. So thank you again. And
my pleasure.
Thank for everybody waking up with us this morning.
Thanks so much, Yanick. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure.